Hello and welcome back to another episode of Tash Teaches. I'm Tash, and in today's video I'd like to show you 3 ways to make the new Bitwig 5 browser less awful. When the beta version came out, I had a huge amount of fun playing around with the global project modulation and remote controls, and I enjoyed myself substantially playing around with the MSEGs. But the rather strange total aesthetic and functional overhaul of the browser left me a little frustrated. Needless to say, I had a look into the manual and found a couple of cool new features that have changed my opinion of it. So without further ado, let's jump right in and I'm going to show you exactly what I'm talking about.
Since the dawn of time, Bitwig has had 2 browsers. There's the browser panel off to the right-hand side here, and then there's the pop-up browser. Anytime we see one of these little plus logos that are all over the place, it will bring up a pop-up browser that you can then move around, and you can scale it, for some reason not diagonally. You can scale them horizontally and vertically individually, but it's rather strange that we can't do that diagonally. Regardless, these pop-up browsers now have a rather cool new feature with this overhaul that's called contexts. And what a context is depending on where and when you press one of these pluses, you can save 19 different preset browser settings. I'm going to go through all of them individually here, and I'll sort of quick cut through the video. The first and foremost is inserting a new track. So if we're going to press a plus here, this could be either an instrument or an audio channel. So we have the option to say, let's pick, when we insert a new everything, I want, for example, to see every possible thing. I don't want to be deciding specifically on instruments or specifically on audio effects right now. I want to be able to pick anything. So I'm going to pick my everything option here. And then all you have to do is right-click, browser settings, and use current selections for this context. And this is adding new track. So that's the name of this first context, adding a new track. I'm going to press that, and I can close this out. And you'll now see that every time I press just an empty space plus, we now have everything. So I could go into saying I want my CLA drums. And CLA drums is an audio effect which we wouldn't have necessarily seen if by default we were looking at instruments. But because of the fact that we're on everything, I could also search for polysynth, and we're going to get everything there. I personally think that if you're doing an empty nothing, it makes quite sense to see everything. Next up, we have adding to an empty instrument track. So that is, you can see here, an instrument track. We can see because it's got a little keyboard there. If I'm going to press plus here, well, I quite like the idea of having access to all of these instruments. So for me, that's fine. But let's say, for example, I wanted to say, just show me synths, for example. I could then click this. I could right-click, browser settings, use current context selections for this context, empty instrument track. And now, if I were to just make a new instrument track and add a plus, you can see that I've gone straight to synths. I don't want that. I think that's irritating. So this can now be a reason to show you the next feature, which is browser settings, restore defaults for current context. That will then mean that we now have all instruments, and if I delete that, new channel, and press plus, we're back to having all instruments. Bloody wonderful. The next would be adding to an empty audio channel. So if I'm going to press plus here, again, I quite like the idea of having these default audio effects, but let's say, for example, we wanted to instead have just Bitwig devices, so we don't want any VSTs here. All I have to do is select what I want to see. Maybe we'll even go a bit wild and say we only want reverbs. Right-click, browser settings, and you can see here, empty audio track. Also interesting to note that the audio track context, this one we've got here, so let's actually just buffer out of this and we'll say we just want Bitwig devices. I can say use current selection for this context, empty audio tracks, and because an effects channel is technically an audio track, all I have to do is press plus and you can see that it's going to behave the same way. So this context of empty audio track pertains to not just audio tracks here, but also effects channels down there. And of course, any effects channels that are also in a group would behave in exactly the same way. The next context deals with adding note effects. So if we've already got a note effect here and we've got some sort of instrument, if I press plus either before or after, we're going to have a context that allows us to change this. So let's say, for example, I always want to have note effects. Rather than any of these bullshit presets, I just want these note effects settings. I can now click note effects, browser settings, and use current selection for this context, inserting note effects. So now if I press plus beforehand, we just get that. And I think as well, if I don't have anything and I'm just adding it before the instrument, there we go, this is going to be the same thing. I don't particularly want all of these note presets and stuff. I specifically want to just see these note effects, so this is quite handy for me. Also, if you're in the note section here and we press plus, you're going to get the same thing. The next context deals with when you have a note effects but nothing after it. If I press plus now, you can see we only go to instruments, but I might actually want to be able to add another note effects in there. So I'm going to select show me everything, because again, if I haven't decided yet what I want, I'd like to have the access to everything. So here if we go to browser settings, you can see inserting note effects or instrument. So pressing plus, if I were to have a plus now, you can see that we have access to everything. So I could do note repeats or I could do polysynth. The next context deals with adding an audio effect. So if we're going to add something after an instrument, or let's say, for example, we've already got an instrument, adding something either before or after is adding an effect. Now, if I press plus here, you can see that I've got quite a lot of options. These options take into account all of the presets of the Bitwig plugins and also all of my VSTs. So for me, it would make a lot more sense under file kind to say, well, I just want access to the Bitwig presets, the Bitwig instruments and my plugins. I'm not that interested in adding any presets. I don't want to have to scroll through them. I don't want them coming up as options. So I can select devices and plugins. And now if I do browser settings, use current selections for this context, inserting audio effects, you'll now see that if I add here, we have access to all of my plugins and all of my devices, but none of the presets. This suits me very nicely. The next context deals with adding something before a note detector on an audio channel. So let's say, for example, I am receiving some MIDI from another channel. If I press plus here, maybe I want to say, well, I definitely want to have access to just my note effects here. So this context is audio effects or note detector. So I can select that, and then that means that anytime I try and add something directly before, or if I have an instrument on an audio channel and I press plus, we're going to get that same context here, which is inserting audio effects or note detectors. The next context deals with adding layers to a note effects layer or selector. You can see that if I press plus here, once again I have access to all of the bloody presets, and I'm not interested in the presets, all I'm looking for is the note effects themselves. So I'm going to click that, right click, and you can see here that this is new note layer. Very nice. If I press plus now, I can add a filter and I can just go straight to being able to add the things I want without having to see all of the bullshit I don't. The next context is adding to an instrument layer. So pressing plus here, I have access to every instrument and every bloody preset, and once again I don't want that. So I'm going to go here to file kind, devices and plugins. I'm not interested in having any of the presets, so right click, browser settings, new instrument layer context. So now if I add an E-hat, I can go straight in, I can add a lounge lizard, fantastic. It works in the same way as if I add a reverb, and I'm now going to do the next context, which is an audio effects layer. If I add a plus here, once again I've got all of the bloody presets, so I'm not interested, file kind, we're going to go for devices and plugins. Right click, browser settings, and this context is called new audio layer. The next context involves adding to a drum machine. If I'm going to press plus here, you can see that I've got drum hits straight off the bat. And I don't necessarily really care too much for this. What I'd rather have access to is just my sample selection here. I've got a folder called one shots, and I want to use my sample folder. So I can open this up, and actually by opening this folder down and then pressing right click, browser settings, and this is adding drum pad, what's nice is if I pick a sound and I press plus, not only does it open it up, but it opens up with this folder opened already. So that means I can navigate straight to shakers or knocks or kicks, and I can use my pre-organized setup. And that means I also exclude all of this silly Bitwig drum hits folder. The next context deals with adding to a sampler. If I click Browse Samples, Multi-Samples, we have access to everything here. Now that might actually be quite handy for this particular idea, but I'm going to go in and say, actually, I'd rather just see my entire sound content library. So that's got my one-shots, but it's also got all of my organized. There's about a terabyte of samples here. I want that to be what I see first. And so I'm going to open these up so I can have access to all of them straight off the bat. Why won't you open? I suppose I need to increase the size there. I'm going to make it so I have access to all of this straight off the bat. Right click, browser settings, and let's select this context, which is browsing sampler resources. And in theory, as I open it up, we should get the browser in the correct size and everything, which is just fantastic. That means I can go straight into genres and instruments and unorganized if I wanted to do that. Adding a clip to a MIDI channel goes straight to note clips, and these are all going to be MIDI files. This is actually probably quite a good idea. If you had a different place where you'd like to find your MIDI clips, I'd go there and browser settings, new launcher clip. The next context is adding to an audio clip. So if we're going to add a clip on here, straight away it takes us to this option of samples and clips, which is a rather strange little conglomeration that we have available here. Instead, I'm going to go up here to my collections, and if I want to be even quicker, I don't actually have to click it. I can press Command 0, and then that will take me to my locations. And I'm just going to navigate to my samples folder, because I'd in fact like to use my sound content location where all of my loops are. And I'm going to navigate down to samples here, and I'm going to use this as my basis. So browser selection, use current selection, new launcher clip. So once again, if I open this up, now I can go straight into having access to my Afro House or straight into country if I so desire. The next context is for periodic curves, and periodic curves are used by the scroll oscillator and the curves modulator. If you press plus here, you can see that by default it shows just the periodic curves in here. But if, say, for example, you want to be able to have access to all 169 of these, you could select any category and then browser settings, use current selections for this context. I'm going to do that because why the hell not? That means that I can just instantly load up something like this. Let's go for the just attack. Let's see what that sounds like. Quite cool. The same works for curves. Here, if I press plus, you can now see that I have any category. The next context is for envelope curves, which right now only works with segments. If I open this up, you can see that by default it goes to envelope. But again, I might want to use any one of these. So let's do use current selections for this context, envelope curves. That means that straight away I can go in and open up something really quite strange. Let's see what this sounds like. The next context is for sequence curves. That only applies to the slopes device in Polygrid, all of the grids. And if you press plus here, you can see that it straight away shows us just the sequences. But again, I might want to just go straight into any category, so I can use all of the curves and use current selection for sequence curves. The final context is for lookup curves. So that is for the key track plus modulator down here, and also for the transfer device up here. So if I chuck that in there, straight away you can see that it pulls up and we have lookups. And again, we might want to go straight in and have the possibility of any one of these. So that would be the browsing lookup curves. The next thing I'd like to talk about is creating collections, because this has become almost a little bit confusing, I have to say. One thing that's quite a good idea is to go up here or press Command 0, and you can then navigate to adding all sorts of sound locations. I'm just going to jump in here to my samples folder. And I'm going to go down to genres, and let's find something that doesn't have too many files. Maybe I'll go for this Psytrance folder. I'm going to open up Psytrance, and I'm going to highlight every single one of these samples. Let's also stop that. Now I'm going to create a new collection for my Psytrance samples. So I'm going to press the plus here and create a collection. Let's call it Psytrance. And I'm going to pick that to be red, because That feels pretty fitting. Now all I have to do is highlight all of them, right click, and I'm just going to add Psytrance. Now the one thing I will point out is that if you have a huge folder, like some of mine here, like house and old loops, I've got 21,000 files in there. Bitwig doesn't tag them all in one go. So the reason why I even picked a smaller file is because it seems as though it probably peaks at about 1,000. If you've highlighted all of them and then you select, you may be tricked into thinking that all of your samples are there. But say, for example, I go into now, let's go to Techno. I'm going to make a new folder here for Techno. And we're going to make this yellow. There's 4,163 samples in my Techno folder. And you would think that if I were to just add them all to Techno, it also takes a little while to go through. It looks as though I've done them all, but you would be mistaken because as you scroll down, you can see that it didn't quite get all of them. And what was weird is I knew that I had, how many in my house folder? I knew that I had like 24,000 samples in there. And when I'd added my house folder to the side here, I was confused as to why there was only, if I go up here to my collections, I was confused as to why there was only 5,000 or 1,000 files in here. And I had to go through and probably do, 25 iterations of adding all of my files. Because now if I go to Techno, you can see that it's only tagged 1,169 of them. If I go actually back to my samples in general, let's go back to samples here, and then we'll go down to Techno, wherever that was. You can see that again, at a certain point, it stopped tagging them, so I would need to go in and I would need to highlight the next bout. I'm going to highlight all of these guys, press yellow, and this does take a little bit of time. It's not the quickest I've ever experienced, but once you have got all of your files coded, let's see if it can get through the rest of these in one go. Okay, yeah, so it seems as though it's managed to do all of the rest of these samples. So now everything is located in my Techno folder. Now, just so that you see what it usually looks like when you open up the browser, you now have the option to create a sort of custom sidebar. And when you've created some collections, you can go up here to your collections, and you can see that I've created Techno, Psytrance, Percussion, House, Disco. At this point, if you want to have access to them instantly on the side in every browser, all you have to do is just drag it down. And for some reason, it seems as though you have to bring it above the My Library. So I can say, let's have House, Techno, Disco, and then I'm going to do Percussion, and I'm going to do Cinematic below that, and I don't want Psytrance up there. But now you can see that I have access to this browser, and if I add another one, you can then adjust the order of them down here, and if you want you can add favorites as well. And you can get pretty customized about with what you want. You could even, in theory, drag a file here, so you could have direct access to your samples, or direct access to just one-shots. I can do that, so I've got my one-shots, my samples. I don't really like having this samples plus clips folder that they say by default, so I can just also remove that. If you right-click on it and do remove from quick sources, you can get back to exactly having how you wanted it. Also, if you fuck this up, you can remove individually, or as we said, you can restore quick sources to defaults. And that's a nice, quick and easy way of getting back to where you were. I am just going to now add my one-shots, my samples, and then under my collections, I'll do house, percussion, and disco. Those are the ones I use the most. Of course, you can do that with any of your locations, and you could also do it with any type of thing in your kind folder as well, and any package. You can just add them all here. It's very nice to be able to have these quick sources. This custom menu bar off to the side in your browser, you can also create the same thing up here in your permanent file browser. Again, I don't want my samples and clips, so I'm going to get rid of that. I also don't want the Bitwig presets. I also don't want all devices. I'd rather just have everything. So let's just get rid of that. And then I can now go in and say, okay, well, under my collections, I want access to my one-shots, I want access to my samples, and I also, of course, want access to my house, percussion. Let's just go in there again. Percussion. Oh. And you can press Command 0 anywhere as well to just pull up your collection. So it doesn't just have to be in this view. If I'm over here and I just press Command 0, if I'm in my browser section, I press Command 0, it will just pull up my collection. So I can then go, let's add percussion, and I want to add disco. This is a really, really great way of making your browser specific to your needs.
Well folks, that's sadly all we have time for today, but I do hope that this video has been useful. If you enjoyed it, then please remember to like, comment and subscribe, and smash that notification bell to keep up to date with all of my future videos too. In the meantime, happy Friday and happy creating.